But thinking about today, if you have a historical lens, you know we're living in a remarkable moment for Muslim-Jewish relations, and that we have opportunities that we'd never had before.
So when there was a Muslim ban, there were more Jews demonstrating than Muslims, and I was, honestly, tears came to my eyes.
Welcome to the special English episode of our podcast, Mecca and Jerusalem. This research project is a podcast on Jewish-Muslim relations, which is funded by the Volkswagen Foundation and located at the Center for Jewish Studies in Heidelberg, or as it is known in German, the Hochschule für Jüdische Studien Heidelberg. The team consists of our two project coordinators, Frederik Musal, Professor for Jewish Thought and Philosophy, and Johannes Becke, Professor for Israel and Middle East Studies, our student assistant Dana Diamant, and myself, Beza Aslan, the project assistant. We aim at bringing research on Muslim-Jewish relations to a wide and also non-academic audience, both in terms of age groups and religious backgrounds. We also want to address increasing alienation between Jews and Muslims in Germany, driven by Islamophobia, Muslim anti-Semitism, and the Middle East conflict. This special English episode was produced within the framework of my Silke Temple Fellowship at the German-Israeli Future Forum Foundation. This year, the program is dedicated to the topic Israel and Germany in the U.S. election year. As part of my project on Jewish-Muslim relations in Germany, Israel, and the US, there is this English version of the podcast episode, as well as a German version and an article that was published in the journal Internationale Politik. More information about the fellowship program and the German-Israeli Future Forum Foundation can be found in the episode description. If you don't listen to this podcast regularly, the only thing that might come to your mind about Jewish-Muslim relations is the Middle East conflict. And yes, Jewish-Muslim relations are not always easy. On both sides, there are deep prejudices and established stereotypes, be it conspiracy theories that blame the Jews and Israel for many things, or the fear of a so-called Islamization and Sharia law on the other hand. We cannot avoid the Middle East conflict, nor the anti-Semitism in some Muslim communities or Islamophobia in some Jewish communities. In this episode, however, we deliberately wanted to look beyond the German borders. Together with you, we want to take a virtual trip to 3 different countries where Jewish-Muslim relations face their own challenges. We'll be going to Germany, Israel, and the United States. And even if we can't avoid some difficult issues, there are often questions that go beyond the Arab-Israeli conflict. We will see remarkable initiatives to put Jewish-Muslim relations on a new footing. So we want to know, what can we learn or even adopt from what's going on in the American and Israeli context here in Germany? In the US, for example, a delegation from the Islamic World League, together with one from the American Jewish Committee, visited the Holocaust Memorial in Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. In Israel, there are school projects in which Hebrew-speaking teachers teach in Arabic-speaking schools and vice versa. And it is precisely there, in Israel, that we're going to start. At first glance, the Arab-Israeli conflict is of course the most significant thing going on here. But we will see that there are also completely different topics in the everyday lives of the Jewish and Muslim people there.
To help understand Israel's diversity, here are a couple of facts about its population. Israel has a population of approximately 8.8 million. 14% are Muslim and 81% are Jewish. Christians and Druze are also represented, at about 2% of the entire population. While Hebrew is the official language of the state, Arabic has a special status. There are Arabic schools, Arabic media, and, of course, Arabic-speaking representatives in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. So even though Jews constitute the majority of Israel's inhabitants, due to migration from various other countries, its population is not at all homogeneous.
It might appear that Jewish and Muslim people in Israel live in animosity toward one another, and that good relations seem impossible. But this is not necessarily the case. To get some better insight into this, we talked to Eric Rudnitsky. He is a project manager at the Konrad Adenauer Program for Jewish-Arab Cooperation at Tel Aviv University, and he discussed with us the challenges entailed in research of Jewish-Muslim relations in Israel.
I believe that the main challenge here, when you're trying to study the relations between Jews and Muslims, is that we are basically dealing with a national conflict. So in many aspects, the national is the religious and the religious is the national, because we speak on the Holy Land, and in particular the holy places in the holy city, Jerusalem, Al-Quds. So the Al-Haram Sharif, the Muslim Al-Haram Sharif, is the Jewish Temple Mount. We have to bear in mind that both communities perceive themselves as the native community for this land. Muslims here in the State of Israel, what came to be known as the State of Israel since 1948, are native to this land. And also many of the Jews that were born and raised here in the State of Israel see themselves as native to this land as well, as they return to their ancestors' land for more than 2,000 years.
What is happening here at the level of civil society, and how are the two communities currently changing?
When you're trying to understand what are the perspective of the Jewish and Muslim as religions, you get to know that there are many common denominators. Both Islam and Judaism are monotheistic religions. There are many similarities, and this has its own implications on the social level. And we see it in the civil society organizations when there are some cooperation between communities. I think that the idea of mutual understanding and try to help each other, it is rooted in both religions. The main idea to help needy peoples and to put an emphasis on the social organization, the SCO, the civil society organizations, is rooted in both Islam and Judaism. But this does not mean necessarily that you have to be an observant believer. I think this is a cultural thing here.
Eric Rudnitsky has not only observed changes in everyday life or in civil society organizations here, but also on the university campus.
In real life on campus, both Jewish and Muslim students take mutual classes together. So they have no other option than to cooperate. Of course, we have. This does not mean that the two communities are fully integrated with each other, but the general atmosphere is not that polarized. Students are like the beating heart of the society, and from time to time, whenever we had some national conflict or national events, like during the month of May, when Israel celebrates its Day of Independence, and the Arab community commemorate the Palestinian Nakba Day, we see some polarization going on campus. But usually the relations are quite normal, I have to say. Just go down to the cafeteria and go down to the library, and you see, you hear Hebrew and Arabic. You see like religious Muslim woman sitting with the secular Jewish man, exchanging thought, trying to understand and to talk on the academic tasks. I think that first we should not ignore the conflict, and actually we have to deal with it. Because what we see in public opinion polls that there is a greater willingness to hear the other side's narrative. We are people. We are individuals. I said before that, well, we have much in common, and we face the same challenges on the social and economic and even on the political level.
Mohammad Darawshe also discussed challenges at the social, economic, and political levels. Because for him, as director of the Center for Equality and Shared Society at Givat Chaviva, it's not just about eating hummus and falafel together, but about creating social equality. At Givat Chaviva, Darawshe tries to break down existing hierarchies in Israeli society. Our conversation was about the coexistence of Muslim and Jewish citizens of Israel, but also about how we can still find common ground, even when we disagree.
You can agree or disagree on issues. You can like or dislike each other, but you have mutual interests. We share the same economy. We share the same environment. We have the same government, whether we like it or not. We have the same public transportation. We have the same university system, the same academic system, the same job market. How do we make it work? How do we make it functional despite disagreements or narratives, and despite maybe even liking or disliking of each other? We don't have to sing peace songs in order to be able to have a functional relationship. We don't have to engage in resolving identity issues when larger conflicts around us are not resolved. So we make a combination between two components. One, which is good relations, which the old theories speak about. We want to have good relations between Jewish and Muslim populations. But at the same time, we want equality. But there's no equality. That's not the coexistence we want. Coexistence that also talks about equality and where there's parity in social, economic, and political steps. So in the past, the center was only about education. Today, we're also about policy change. Bottom up is something important and good, but in order to speed it, you need top-down policy that speeds the process of equal integration, and that's what we're busy doing.
What do daily interactions between Arab and Jewish people in Israel actually look like?
In most cases, you have no opinion about a person until you interact with them. And I must admit that the massive majority of daily interactions are either neutral or positive. They're neutral or positive mostly when you avoid the political issues or you avoid identity issues. And I must say maybe there's maybe 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100 of cases of interaction that have some kind of tension based on either stereotypes or racist perspectives of individuals. But most people live in segregated communities. 92% of the Palestinian Arab citizens live in separate Arab towns and villages. Only 8% of both populations live in mixed towns or mixed neighborhoods. And that's where the interaction is a bit more significant. But still, the younger generation has more interaction. My children who are, I have 2 children at university. At university, there is a much more significant interaction. And this is becoming more and more the norm among higher educated populations. So integration is happening more in the middle upper class. There's more interaction. Lower classes have what I would call maybe 9 to 5 relations, workday relations.
So there are actually lots of people who have no real contact with the other group apart from at the grocery store or on the street. Mohammad Darawshe, with help from both Jewish and Arab Israelis, is trying to address this by developing the so-called Roadmap for Shared Society.
It's called the Roadmap for Shared Society. And what I tried to do with that, I gathered about 70 people, half Arab and half Jewish, and basically said to them, let's assume we can put our differences on a parking mood. So let's put this agreement on a parking mood and see where we can move. And we identified 5 areas where we can move in, whether it is in governance, in economics, in land, in education, in social other issues. And we worked for almost 2 years. And we came up with a fascinating document that now we're presenting it to the government as a policy plan.
At Givat Chaviva, there are projects that try to bring about change on a political level, but also other initiatives, like a very special school project. Mohammed Darausha told us more about this.
In 2005, I initiated a project that tries to combat this segregation in education, where all Jews go to Jewish schools and all Arabs go to Arab schools. Kids never meet. And the only one you meet is that superficial interaction. But you come with your loaded stereotypes. So 2005, I initiated the project. I call it Cross-Sector Teachers Program, to place Arab teachers in Jewish schools and Jewish teachers in Arab schools. And we found that in 93% of the cases, this is the first time an Arab child meets a Jewish person or a Jewish child meets an Arab person. And in 63% of the cases, this relationship, this interaction, which usually lasts for more than 2-3 years with the same teacher, changes the perspectives of those children to the positive. The remaining are not all negative but it didn't change them. So, and the reason that happens is because you have that person in your life. They're not the other anymore. They become part of your life. They enter your classroom once or twice a week. You meet them in the break. They invite your parents to talk about your grades. They join you in your celebrations, whether it is a religious holiday or just going to the parks. They talk about their brother's wedding or something like that. We do it creates a process of what we call humanization. And humanization is the answer for stereotypes. When I started with this project, I started with 6 schools in 2005. Today, this project is operating in 1,350 schools. The kids that go through this, they don't think that they're meeting the other. It just happens naturally. You normalize the presence of the other without having to make an issue out of it. I think that's a way to fight extremism. You make a different lifestyle. If they continue to live in their segregated realities, they'll continue to live in their pools of racism and their pools of extremism. Most is the result of ignorance. And I think that the way to deal with those groups is by giving them access to educate themselves.
It is not only Arab Muslims that want more equality, but also Mizrahi Israelis or Jews, whose parents or grandparents came from countries with Muslim majorities, like from Morocco, Iraq, or Iran. They came to Israel later than the European Jewish or Ashkenazi founder generation, and are to this day underrepresented in economic and academic establishments. Avi Shilon is a professor of political science, specializing in the field of modern Jewish and Israeli history. We spoke about the representation of Arabic Jews and women in Israeli universities, as well as about his own background.
My parents came from Baghdad, from Iraq. So in a way, and they didn't want me to know Arabic, unfortunately, because, they were born and raised on the classical Zionist perception that we should forget or abandon our exilic heritage, especially if it is an Arab culture. But obviously my identity is also a Middle Eastern identity, and I can sense it more and more as long as I'm immersing myself in the academic sphere, which is much more Ashkenazi in Israel. I can sense how much I'm different from them because of my Iraqi background. Generally speaking, there is only something like 10% of the professors in Israel are Mizrahi, and the other are Ashkenazi, most of them male, some of them women, but most of them, white male Ashkenazi Israelis. And it's a huge problem, but it is changing. I cannot say that it is, continuing in the same way that it used to be. It's surely going to take time. We are surely in an era that people are much more aware to this problem. Awareness is the first step. This is changing with respect to women and with respect to Mizrahi.
Avi Shilon talks about change, not only a change in self-perception within Israeli society, but also a shift in the understanding of what it means to belong to a certain region.
Many Israelis are right now much more ready to define themselves as Arab Jews, but Arab Jews and right-wing alike. So it's interesting, and right now it doesn't really pave the way for a cooperation or coexistence between Jews and Muslims, but I think it's the beginning. So I think this idea of regionality, let's think about ourselves as the people of the Middle East, not only as Jews and Muslims, and the idea of common shared pillars of religion that we can project the similarities of Islam and Judaism could help us to heal the rifts of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are terms relevant not only in Israel, but also in the U.S. Let us consider how many Muslims and Jews actually live in the U.S., and what the statistics of so-called hate crimes look like. The majority-minority relations in the United States are very different in comparison to Israel and Europe. The Jewish minority in the U.S. is 6.9 million and exceeds the Muslim minority of 3.45 million. According to the statistics of the U.S. Department of Justice for 2018, 59.6% of victims were affected due to their ethnicity, and 18.7% due to their religious affiliation. Here, 53% of perpetrators were white, whereas only 24% were black, and 12.9% were classified as unknown. Crimes against Jewish Muslim people could also be categorized as motivated by racial hatred. Being Jewish is not only a religious affiliation, but also an ethnicity, and Muslims often become victims of hate crimes because of their skin color.
In the United States, right-wing terrorism threatens Muslims and Jews, as well as other minorities. One strategy to fight back involves enhancing Jewish-Muslim cooperation, something that is no longer uncharted territory in America. There are numerous projects, some of which have been running for years. To learn more, I spoke with Mehnaz Afridi. She is a Muslim who leads the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College. She spoke to us about why it is so important for Jews and Muslims to engage in self-criticism, and about the central messages she wants to convey through her teaching and scholarship.
One of my messages has been in my work, my book, how I teach, is looking at memory, how we remember our tradition in relationship to another tradition, how we remember somebody else's tradition. So we have to make adjustments if we're willing to work together. Muslims don't accept certain things about Christianity, but we accept Christ as a prophet. But we had to make adjustments to say, okay, you believe that he suffered for your sins. We don't have original sin. So these are all the things that I think are important for us to challenge ourselves with. But also as a Muslim woman, I have to say, okay, we human beings are not pure. That's why in the Quran we're reminded over and over again of our lessons of justice and morality. So I think that's very important for Jews and Muslims to have a self-critique of who they are and to stop holding on to materialism like land and memory of identity. And a purity and a longing that sometimes Muslims say, Islam was so great in this time. We had our inventions and we were wonderful. We were calligraphers and scientists and doctors. We all know that. But that's not where we are anymore. So we have to also recognize the shift And we have to be, in a way, naked about our own shortcomings. And I think that's the way I approach my classes and my work. Still coming out believing being a Muslim, because we have to take accountability for who we are.
We sometimes dream of an ideal age, one in which Jewish, Muslim, and Christian people live together peacefully. But what often happens instead is that we whitewash the past. In her book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, published in 2017, Meinaz Afridi deals with anti-Semitism in Muslim groups, and why some Muslims relativize the Shoah.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced, I wrote my book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, because of the anti-Semitism in the Muslim community. And as a Muslim, I believed it's wrong to deny anyone's history or to relativize Holocaust, to have the same kind of tropes, anti-Semitic tropes that Europeans had about Jews. I felt like we could do much better than this. This is not who we are. So I think there's always a comparison, and a comparison which is really very weak, and it makes people pull apart by saying, my suffering is larger than yours, and what happened to you in the 40s? Well, we don't care, because look what's happening. So that's just not how I think we can actually have dialogue or understanding or peace. I think it pulls us apart. So in a sense, I'm asking people to reconstruct their history about each other, but through the eyes of the other, right? So when I say to Muslims, read your Quran, but don't just read the Quran and say you know the Torah and the Bible, but you must read them for themselves.
The U.S. is different not just from Israel, but also from Germany and German society. So we wanted to know what Jewish-Muslim solidarity looks like in the United States, and what differences exist compared to Germany.
Okay, so I think of Europe and the U.S. very differently in terms of Jewish-Muslim relations. Not necessarily because of the population, because there are more Muslims in, say, Germany than there are, I have more of a positive, optimistic outlook on the United States, because the Jews and Muslims have built a solidarity here. The largest organization, Islamic Society of North America, and American Jewish Committee work together, and they do advocacy work, which I think is super important. So when there was a Muslim ban, there were more Jews demonstrating than Muslims, and I was, honestly, tears came to my eyes. There are very strong foothold of Jews and Muslims that work together. They're willing to not deal with the conflict directly, but are willing to advocate for each other because we are Americans. And that's the difference. So there's religious freedom here. We can wear whatever we want, which is a huge difference in terms of parts of Europe. And yeah, there is a lot of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, still higher anti-Semitism than Islamophobia in the United States. I think it's taken time for Jews to trust one another this way, Jews and Muslims. And Jews have been advocating for Muslims in a lot of ways. Also, the persecutions that are going on, like with the Uyghur Muslims in China, Jews are at the forefront of that. Same thing with the Rohingya crisis. It was the same during Sudan and Darfur. So I think those things are very important to recognize and move forward with those things. So, the question in Europe, I think, is who is a citizen? It's still very much there. The question here is, if you're a Muslim citizen, how do you get treated? So I think these are very interesting questions. And that's why I think we should work with Muslims in Berlin and Jews in Berlin, because I think we could exchange a lot. We could give a lot of ways and strategies to better the relationship and learn from each other and the ways that we're doing it.
In our conversation with Meinaz Afridi, you heard about the American Jewish Committee, or AJC. When it comes to our Jewish-Muslim relations at the AJC, one name stands out: Ari Gordon. He is the AJC's Director of Jewish-Muslim Relations. We asked Ari Gordon which challenges are specific to the U.S. in the area of Jewish-Muslim relations, and what his first associations here are.
When people hear the term Muslim-Jewish relations, they think, what is that? What is relations? I thought it was just conflict. So a lot of people start with the points of challenge. And the ones that we know is major trends that many Jews, and this is certainly true of American Jews, identify with the state of Israel as a Jewish state. And so they hear that narrative in the conflict most. And many Muslims, whether they're Arab or Palestinian or not, connect to fellow religionists, Palestinians, most of whom are Muslim. Of course, there are many Palestinian Christians. So the narrative that they tend to hear is a Palestinian narrative in the conflict. And the sense that these are irreconcilable views between our communities, or the loudest voices in our communities who say that if you cross this line, you're a traitor, that's one major challenge. Another, I would say, is the existence of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia within our communities. And this is not always intentional, but there is a culture of fear of the other, or an understanding of the other that comes only through negative framing. And there's long histories and reasons for that. But when we say mutual suspicion, it's sometimes because we are cultural carriers of prejudice towards the other. I would say there are other challenges that are not as heated. Like in the United States, the American Muslim community is one of the most diverse religious communities that there is. And as much diversity as you would see at the Hajj, you see in the neighborhood in Brooklyn of Flatbush, right? And in some mosques, you'll see that much diversity as well. And so for us as Jews, we have a certain amount of diversity too, but you have to understand each community on its own terms. And as an American Muslim identity is crystallizing, I don't think it will ever be monolithic, but if I connect to African American Muslims the same way that I connect to Turkish Muslims, the same way that I connect to South Asian Muslims, as if there was no diversity even within those three groups, but if I connect to them all in the same way, I'm not really going to make a trusting and robust relationship. So I'd say the diversity is another major challenge here as well. And if dialogue is only the search for commonality, then we may erase our identities and what makes us unique. And we lose an opportunity to learn from one another too.
Social diversity is often addressed and recognized very openly in the United States. It often happens that people call themselves Muslim American or Jewish American. This year, the U.S. has been in the media not only because of the Black Lives Matter protests and hate crimes, but also because of the U.S. elections. What are the challenges facing Jewish-Muslim relations? And what does this mean for the Jewish and Muslim communities in the U.S.?
A person doesn't have to be a practicing Jew or a very observant Muslim to know that there are forces working against us out there. And there are those who would politically like to do that by banning religious law. In the United States, that's an anti-Sharia campaign, but it has equal impact on Jewish communities. And frankly, hate crimes is a real issue that Jews year after year are the largest religious group that's a target of hate crimes. And in most of the last years, Muslim Americans have been the fastest growing number of hate crimes. And you don't have to look at hate crime statistics. You can just look on social media to know that we're being called out and targeted in a lot of ways. We are in a very polarized time in American political culture. And it's probably, if you asked any individual, it's probably less so than it is in the public sphere and media and social media, but it is very pronounced. And Muslims and Jews get caught up in this. But you talked about the Black Lives Matter movement, and you talked about the protests and the awareness of racial disparity and racial injustice that's come in the wake of a number of recent killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others. The largest group that experiences hate crimes year after year are Black Americans of all religious backgrounds. And so, of course, there's common cause here, even if we don't have exact solutions that we could all get behind. The polarization that is there has a special challenge for Muslims and Jews.
The polarization of society thus poses a particular challenge for Jewish and Muslim people in the U.S. But how can this be avoided or best solved?
In the United States, our political parties, some of the most extreme voices would have us believe that you have to look at Jewish identity or Muslim identity as belonging to one camp. Now, of course, we have to find allies, and every community should work with people to get things done. But at AJC and at the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, we are doggedly zealously bipartisan, because our belief is that if we tie our identity as minorities, Muslims are 3.5 million out of over 300 million. Jews are 6 million out of over 300 million. If we tie our identity to only one party and our identities become a partisan issue, we really lose out.
In Germany, too, numerous new formats have emerged that build new narratives of Jewish-Muslim relations. Our podcast is, of course, one of them. But there are also events like the Jewish-Muslim Feminist Festival in Munich, the Shalom Aleikum Project by the Central Council of Jews in Germany, or academic conferences like Jews and Muslims in Germany, which took place in early 2020. At colleges and universities, there are attempts to convey a comprehensive picture of the Middle East, taking into account all its linguistic, cultural, and political relationships. One such attempt is the Near Eastern Master Program at the University of Heidelberg and the Hochschule für Jüdische Studien Heidelberg. But how many Jews and Muslims actually live in Germany? And what are the statistics on politically motivated hate crimes?
On the one hand, there are around 99,000 Jews currently living in Germany, comprising about 0.1% of the total population. On the other hand, there are about 4.4 or 4.7 million Muslims, making anywhere between 5.4 and 5.7% of the total population of Germany. These numbers only account for those who have officially registered in a community, and so there are, of course, other Jews and Muslims who don't belong to a community. Let's take a closer look at anti-Semitic and Islamophobic crimes in Germany. According to the current statistics of the Federal Ministry of Interior, 93.4% of anti-Semitic crimes are motivated by right-wing extremism and have increased by 13% since 2018. A similar tendency can be observed for Islamophobic crimes, 90.1% of which are motivated by right-wing extremism and have increased by 4.4% since 2018.
Surveys among Jewish people in Germany and Europe indicate that anti-Semitic violence is not only perpetrated by right-wing extremists, but often also by Islamists and sometimes by left-wing radicals. Still, both Jewish and Muslim groups in Germany are directly affected by right-wing crimes and hate crimes. More and more communities, foundations, and civil organizations in Germany realize how important it is to forge alliances. Yasmin Soylu, who has been co-organizing Heidelberg's Muslim-Jewish Days of Culture for many years now, shares this opinion. She is the head of studies for Muslim civil society at Teilsein e.V. and is currently working to establish a Muslim academy in Heidelberg. Yasmin Soylu told us more about the aims of Days of Culture and how this format, which is entirely unique in Germany, came about.
Die sind entstanden aus den jüdischen Kulturtagen hier in Heidelberg und aus den
The festival evolved out of the celebratory events we put on here in Heidelberg, called the Jewish Days of Culture and Muslim Days of Culture. One year, we realized we had our second annual Jewish Days of Culture and the first ever Muslim Days of Culture taking place side by side. The organizers thought, why not combine the two events? We have the same goals after all. Why not bring the formats together and turn them into the first nationwide Heidelberg Muslim Jewish Culture Days? The framework of the festival comprises both cultural and political education. We discuss narratives of Muslim Jewish visibility, as well as other aspects of Muslim Jewish life here in Germany. The Muslim Jewish Culture Days create visibility for voices that aren't otherwise heard, of artists, writers, and cultural workers from Jewish and Muslim communities, or those who identify as Jewish or Muslim. On some level, this means making these multiple identities and communities visible, but in a very different way than it tends to happen in contemporary social discourse. This means moving away from problem-oriented or deficit-oriented narratives that surround Muslims or Jews in our society. We'd like to achieve this through the means of cultural and political education.
Und das möchten wir eben über das Mittel der kulturell-politischen Bildung machen.
So Culture Days aim to provide a diverse picture of both communities through various approaches, such as art, film, and panel discussions. But what does the future of Culture Days look like? And how do you deal with any differences that may arise?
Wir möchten Raum schaffen für
We want to create a
Aushandlungsprozesse,
space
wo
for the
man
process
sich
of
auch streiten
negotiation.
kann.
A space where it's actually possible to argue, where it's not only about being positive and focusing on what we have in common, not only about love, peace, and harmony. Rather, we'd like for everyday community or identity to maintain a space for its own values and norms, for its own right to exist. There are many differences and some points where we may not agree, but I think it's good this way. It's important that we speak out, that we can differentiate ourselves, that we can do it in a space where we feel safe, where we have a common goal. Sometimes discussions arise that one would have rather not had, and then we think, well, it's good to have people to talk to when questions like these come up. I believe that if we manage to make this into a continuous process, rather than an isolated point in time, which of course requires a lot of energy and strength, then we'll succeed. I think these voices should be heard not only during the festival, but become tangible and visible for everyone
langfristig
long term.
greifbar und für alle sichtbar machen können.
The Heidelberg Muslim-Jewish Culture Days are geared toward local and civic engagement. But there are further programs and initiatives that do this on a pan-European level. Ilya Zukrovsky can tell us a lot about this. After all, he is the founder of the Muslim-Jewish Conference, an annual 6-day conference that took place in Berlin in 2015 and 16. And further initiatives are currently underway. In the past, these formats have brought over 160 young Muslim and Jewish people together from more than 65 countries. For this episode, Ilya Zukrovsky told us more about what lies behind his initiative and how it actually came about.
I was on an academic trip for the University of Vienna. As a young Austrian Jew, I had had very little contact with the Muslim community. Not because I decided not to, but it was just like that if you weren't lucky enough to be in the same school class or members of the same gym, the contact was minimal. So my first really long and deep conversation with a young Muslim actually happened at an international conference, where a group of Pakistanis came over to me and said something along the lines of, "Sorry to annoy you, but you're the first Jew that we've met. Let's go get a coffee." And that was a sort of a blueprint for the conference. We sat together and spent an entire day, shocked to find out how much of what we believed about each other just wasn't true. We presumed to know so much about others without ever having met them. In other words, without seeing for ourselves, we just believed what we'd heard. This friendship began to spread. I informed my friends, he informed his. They became curious and new contacts were made. As a result, 1 or 2 years later, we decided that we could combine the experiences from international student conferences with a focus on these two groups, which, in our opinion at the time, it was 2010, had no safe space. A space where they could simply talk to each other. That was the idea back then.
Ilya Zukrovsky also spoke about his personal experiences in organizing the first Muslim-Jewish conference and how it was structured in terms of content.
There are two aspects to the conference, the human and the methodological. We had to produce the methodology ourselves. What I find interesting is that this methodology was co-created by volunteers from 120 different countries over the span of 10 years. Lots of people invested their knowledge into it, and it generated a really interesting result. At the beginning, we, quite harshly, share stereotypes and prejudices, without much consideration for the group. This almost resembled an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, insofar as we were brutally confronted with our prejudices. As a result of this confrontation, we realize that there is a problem stemming from too little interaction, that we assume a lot about the other while actually knowing very little. We then continue with things like intra-religious dialogue. That was actually the only time when we really split the groups into Muslims and Jews. They went on to discuss internally, and this shifted the image of the other. Secular Jews have noticed that they're actually more in line with secular Muslims than with religious Jews from their own community. The topic of sexual orientation is often discussed with greater ease across religious boundaries, with members of the other religious community than with one's own. nationalism, the Middle East conflict. There are many such topics where consensus with the other group was much stronger than that with one's own. And then, of course, the image shifts. Who are we? And who are they? That's why at the conference we spend time in large groups of 70 to 100, as well as in small groups of 15 to 20, allowing the participants to build a certain sense of trust.
However, the conference is not only intended to look for common ground and avoid critical topics such as the Middle East conflict. The Muslim-Jewish Conference has developed a strategy for this.
One could disagree on the right of return in Israel, or on other conflicts in the world, but you can still have a common cause. Fight plastic in the Mediterranean, or racism in southern Carinthia, or start a joint refugee project in East Germany. This cooperation across ideological boundaries is possible, even if you don't share an opinion about everything in the world. It doesn't mean that you're facing an enemy. Rather, you're facing someone who has a different opinion.
Remarkable new approaches have been developed in Germany in recent years. But many of these are still in the early stages or have difficulties in obtaining funding. The reasons for this include socio-political differences between Germany and the US, different ways of dealing with hybrid national identities, and a significant increase in hate crimes and right-wing extremist attacks. In Germany, Jewish life is often only acknowledged in a Holocaust context, like through so-called Stolpersteine, stumbling blocks, or memorials. And on the other hand, there are long discussions about whether Islam or Muslims even belong in Germany or not. This is why many Jewish and Muslim people find it difficult to create new narratives that go beyond questions of mere belonging or exclusion. But what does this mean for the future of Jewish-Muslim relations here in Germany or even in Europe? In Germany, Muslim and Jewish institutions need to try to cooperate more closely with each other and seek funding from the public. Although there are many organizations that support different projects, financial resources still pose a major problem for civil society projects and initiatives. So they only last a few years and have to find new sources of income later in their lifespans. So interreligious cooperations should be institutionalized and sustainably supported and maintained. Following the example of the AJC in the United States and Givat Chaviva in Israel, both leaders and individuals from both communities must cooperate and be active on an equal footing. So we need not only school projects, conferences, cultural days, or joint excursions, but also political actors who stand up for these projects in majority society.
In January, when there was the last shooting in New Jersey, and there were a bunch of Jewish organizations and other organizations that did this demonstration. And so a friend of mine, a Jewish rabbi, he reached out to me and he said, "Would you like to speak at the rally?" And I said, "Okay." He said, "We have a lot of speakers, but just 5 minutes." I said, "Okay." So we're walking from New York over to the Brooklyn Bridge, on the Brooklyn Bridge, and it was 35,000 people. Plus, they were just still coming. But I was the only Muslim woman to speak. And and the first thing I said was, a lot of us are suffering for different reasons, but today we are talking about Jews.
With this concluding anecdote by Mehnaz Afridi, we would like to thank you and of course our extraordinary interview partners for the exciting interviews, their time, and the anecdotes. So special thanks go to Arik Rudnitsky, Mohamed Daraushe, Avi Shilon, Mehnaz Afridi, Ari Gordon, Yasemin Soylu, and Ilya Zichrovsky. Special thanks also to David Meyer Lindenberg and Hannah Teddy Schachter for helping us with this English language episode and the English voiceover. Unfortunately, this English version was a special only, so our upcoming episodes and social media are still in German. If you don't want to miss our upcoming episodes and want to get more content anyways, you can subscribe to our channels on Spotify and iTunes. Follow us on Instagram for updates and more information about the interview partners. You can also find the link for the English version of the article to this episode in the description box. Take care, stay healthy, and see you next time.